everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Inner Typewriter, the show with typewriters, coffee, and conversations about how to make our writing better. I'm your host, Scott Calhoun, and with me today is David Kudler. He's the author of Risuko, and also a publisher at Still Point Digital Press and the managing editor at the Joseph Campbell Foundation.
That's right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And
it's good to be here.
I'm so glad you are, because I'm so interested in the hero's journey and how that works, and I'm glad we have an expert on hand to tell us.
Well, I think part of the thing that Joseph Campbell would have said is we all are experts at it. His whole point of the hero's journey wasn't that this is a good plot structure that you should follow or that a lot of people followed, but that it was what he would call an archetype. It's baked into the human brain. It's how we experience stories. And so he was, in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, the book where he laid out the hero journey, he was not talking to writers specifically. He was looking at 5,000 years of stories back from, Gilgamesh and the descent of Inanna, in Babylon, in Mesopotamia, all the way on up to now. For as long as we've had stories, we tell these stories in a certain way. And his take on it, which he largely got from Carl Jung, was that it is something that isn't personal. It isn't learned because we've heard stories this way. It's literally the way that the stories trigger us. It's how we experience them. And so the important thing from a writer's point of view, me as a writer, me as an editor, me as somebody who goes to the movies and watches these things, is that it is less about the writing and the creation and more about the way that it brings me through an experience that transforms me. It's a way of creating almost a ritual where I go through an experience that the protagonist or protagonists have gone through, Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker, whoever, and come out of it, I have been changed as the person watching or reading or listening. I work for the Joseph Campbell Foundation, and we, our mission is to preserve, protect, and perpetuate the work of Joseph Campbell, and that includes The Hero with a Thousand Faces and all of his other work. And so we get a lot of people who come to us and say, so tell us about this hero's journey thing. And we've had, a lot of writers and film and novels and songwriters, but also my favorite, we have video game designers.
Wow.
Well, it's very popular because if you think about it,
yeah.
A video game is the experience of going through one of these stories yourself.
Yeah.
But also my favorite, we had an amusement park designer say, look, I want my rides to feel transformative. I want people to feel like they've done something, they've been somewhere, they've gone through something. So talk to me about what this is. And I thought that was a brilliant way of looking at it, because if you think about it, again, I'd say it, the writing, it's important for us to know as writers what it is, but the essential part of the hero's journey is the audience experience, the reader, the viewer, the listener, the amusement park writer.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it is, in that sense, baked in. It's archetypal.
And it's interesting to me that you say that it's sort of already within us. It's part of our human way of experiencing what happens and making meaning about what happens.
Yeah.
So take us back to when he was first figuring all this stuff out.
Yeah, sure.
And there's a word that I've heard that I just love that he got from Finnegan's Wake called Monomyth. But silly me, I've forgotten what that means. And
well, no, it's a very slippery idea.
Yeah.
So the way that he first got onto this, he was a graduate student in Paris, He was studying the old Arthurian romances, the Knights of the Round Table and the Grail myths and all of that stuff. And because a lot of them were written in France and Germany. So he was there to study all of these old manuscripts. And it was 1927, and so he's there, and one of the first things he does, he's been there a week, and he walks into Shakespeare and Company and buys a copy of James Joyce's Ulysses from Sylvia Beach, who's at her store. And he walks away and sits on the banks of the Seine and reads the first 3 chapters. And I don't know if you've read Ulysses, but there's about 3 chapters in, there's a chapter that starts, the ineluctable modality of the visible, not this, blah, 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 and it's like, holy crap, what's going on here? And that's what he did. He walked back and he said, what is this? And this is he's young at that point, he was 23, but he was a very well-read, very, for 1927, very well-educated young man.
Yeah.
He's looking at this thing, I have no idea what's going on here. He walks back into the bookstore and she's got a stack of books. Because she knows that when somebody walks away with this, they're going to come back and ask that.
Right.
And what she exposed him to, and what Paris exposed him to, was not just the Arthurian romances, and not just James Joyce, but also Indian culture, Hinduism and Buddhism, and the old Indian epics, but also obviously modern literature and art. He had one of his best friends, we just released a book of his letters, and we have a whole correspondence between them. One of his best friends was a painter, and he and she talked about art. But he was also a friend with, I don't know if you know who Krishnamurti was. He was one of the first great teachers of Indian philosophy in the West. And he was just a little older than Campbell. And they met on a cruise ship going over from the US to Paris. And it kind of blew Campbell's mind. So all of this stuff, but also one of the other things, so there was, Hinduism and I think the Bhagavad Gita was one of the books that she gave him, but also a book on modern psychology, which was brand new then. So Freud and Jung. And Campbell, like I said, his mind was blown. And what he did was he looked at all of this stuff, the psychology, the modern literature and art. Picasso was there. He went with his friend and was in Picasso's studio. He was, seeing all of this stuff as it was coming out, reading Joyce's books. And he started to see that all of these stories were, again, to use Jung's term, archetypal, that they all shared certain elements and certain qualities and certain resonances. And he went back, he was getting his PhD at Columbia, and went back and said, I want to expand my thesis. And they said, no, which is what they would do. And then that was in October of 1929, the stock market crashed. He went and he lived in Woodstock for 5 years and read. But the point is that he started to come up with his idea of the hero's journey at this point. And when James Joyce came out in 1939, I think, with Finnegan's Wake, his great masterpiece, the greatest book nobody's ever read.
Right, or understood.
I've read it twice, and I was editing books on James Joyce at the time, and for a while I was able to look at it and go, oh, I think I kind of get what's going on here. And I went back about a year or two ago and tried to reread it, and I was like, what the heck
These
is
words
this?
have moved since I last read them.
Right, because every sentence is a pun, if not a bilingual pun, if not a trilingual pun, if not a gibberish pun.
Yeah.
And so, it's very dreamlike. But there's a couple of words that that Joyce coined in the book, many words he coined in the book, but two that have stuck. One is quark.
Right.
3 quarks for Muster Mark. And
subatomic particle.
yeah, exactly. Well, that's what it became.
Yeah.
But I mean, because there were it came in triads.
Mm-hmm.
The other was the Monomyth, which is his description of this story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same idea that I was talking about. Campbell called it the Monomyth not because there's only, the book that he wrote was called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, because it's always the same hero, because the hero is you as you're reading it or listening to it or watching it. You are the hero. Jungian terms, you're projecting your ego onto this character, and you're going through, whether it's Jon Snow or Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, or using very modern references, but it's all the same experience, the same story. And so in Finnegan's Wake, he calls it the monomyth, the single story. Mm-hmm. And that's where Campbell came up with that name. That was his other name for it. He called it lots of things: the hero's adventure, the hero's journey, the monomyth.
The monomyth. So just in case someone doesn't have the printout of the of the diagram showing what the hero's journey is,
yes,
just take us through each step as briefly as...
There is very, very briefly. It's an 800-page book, so I could go on at great length. But to boil it down the way he did, there's basically 3 parts to the hero's journey. The hero starts out in the world of the everyday, Luke on Tatooine, Scarlett O'Hara at Tara.
Harry Potter
in the well, for him it's the cupboard under the stairs. But what happens is there's what's called a call to adventure. And so the first stage is what he calls separation. So the hero is called to adventure and he either accepts it or rejects it, but is either willingly or unwillingly pulled across what he called the threshold of adventure. And the threshold of adventure is usually a very clear thing. Diagon Alley, the wall into Diagon Alley is a perfect example. Dorothy stepping through the door from sepia tone Kansas into Technicolor. And that was written 10 years before the hero's journey, but if there is a more perfect hero's journey story, I can't think of one. Once you've left the world of the everyday, you go into what Campbell calls the world of adventure, and there you go through the second stage. So the first stage is separation. The second stage is what he calls initiation. And there you go through a series of quests and trials. He calls it the road of trials. And he came up with 4 sort of archetypal things that you go through there: the sacred marriage, the father or mother atonement, apotheosis, and the fire or elixir theft. But he would say these are things that happen in a lot of these myths. Some of them happen in, some myths have all of them, some myths have 1, some myths have 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. They can have the same one in different, shapes. It can be over and over and over again. But the point is that the hero goes through an experience. They die to who they used to be, and usually there's a symbolic death, or sometimes a real death. The Gospels, if you want to read it this way, or the Buddhist stories of the life of the Buddha, take you through a hero's journey where there is a death and resurrection. In more mundane stories, it's, who you are, who you used to be dies, so that who you should be is born. And that then leads you to become a different person, which leads to the third and final stage. And a lot of people, when they think plot structures, think of the Aristotelian mountain, what is it? Inciting action, rising action, climax, falling action,
3-act
conclusion.
structure, kind of a...
Yeah, it's 5 for him, but 3 acts. Rising action, climax, falling action.
Right.
Right, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Campbell, it's a circle. And if you look at the stories, the idea is whether or not you return to the same physical location, where you start defines where you're going to finish. Because otherwise it feels open-ended. It doesn't feel like there's any kind of a conclusion. And so the last stage is what's called the return. And you return, the hero returns, bearing what Campbell calls the elixir, the boon. And it can be anything from a treasure, a magic weapon to slay the monsters that were, harrowing the town, to wisdom, to magic, to, if you think about it, this is the life of the Buddha and the Gospels. This is what they bring back,
right,
is this view of the larger universe. So that's what the hero does. And the hero then changes the world of the everyday. So the 3 stages: separation, initiation, return.
Wow. And it makes a circle. I think
yes,
that's important to
absolutely
for us to note. So I really like your point about how it's not just, the hero's journey isn't just the journey of your character. Like if you're an author thinking about these structures,
sure,
it's actually the interaction of the audience going
absolutely
through your
absolutely
protagonist.
And in fact, when I teach the hero's journey to writers, when I first started it, I thought of it as okay, I'm going to teach this as a plot structure. Well, there's 3 elements to any good writing, right? There's plot, there's character, and there's setting. And I've taught the hero's journey as a way of looking at plot, sure, we just talked about, separation,
right,
initiation, return. But it's also about the psychology of the character, where it's called the hero's journey, where they are on that journey. How does that define them? How does their interaction? Jonah says, I don't want to go to Nineveh. God says, you're going to go to Nineveh. He tries to get away. God sends a whale. He has to jump into the mouth of the whale. How you react to each stage of the journey defines your character. But also setting. Remember that, Dorothy is in Sepia, Kansas, and she steps into Technicolor Oz. The world of the everyday and the, Tatooine, bright, washed out.
Right.
And the world of adventure, the land of adventure, which, Star Wars, it's dark and stars and bright and stark, are totally different places. The Maltese Falcon, these are all 3 Warner Brothers movies in 1939, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, and Maltese Falcon, all perfect hero's journey stories, all written in 10 years before The Hero with 1,000 Faces came out. And the point is, again, to get back to my initial point, that if you use these elements, if you are conscious, then what ends up happening is you bring your audience through an experience that will transform them. They will feel as if they've gone through something meaningful, which is what we all want, right? And so it becomes a much more powerful tool than just, okay, I'm, a quarter of the way in, I need to switch from Act 1 to Act 2.
Right.
I love Robert McKee's story. It's a great book. I found it to be a little dry. And we'll talk about that if you'd like. But where The Hero with 1,000 Faces, for me, is a very open-ended. It doesn't say,
there's only one way to do it.
There's only one way to do it, and if you're going to do it differently, it's saying this is how people expect, this is how our subconscious, unconscious minds channel the energy from the story. We've all had that experience, reading a book, watching a movie, riding on a roller coaster, where you get caught up in it and you feel alive and energized, and I would argue that's partially often because the creator has tapped into these archetypes.
Right. And so your readers are living vicariously through your hero.
Exactly.
And that's why we like stories.
Oh, absolutely. And there has never been a human culture ever that we found that doesn't have stories at its heart. People tell stories. I mean, there's a famous book called Homo Ludens, the game-playing man. We play games. Well, this is one of the games that we all play is storytelling. Mm-hmm. It's how we teach. It's how we change. We tell ourselves stories about what happened to us mm-hmm. in our days. It's how we make sense of what is going on in our lives. And so understanding what the human brain goes through as it goes through a transformative experience, mm-hmm. It's kind of an essential tool for any creative person, I think.
Right. And people don't just wake up one day and decide to be different.
No.
That's not real change.
No.
Real change happens when you go through these
And it happens, through an experience. He would talk about interviews that a friend of his called Stan Groff, who was a psychiatrist in San Francisco, they spoke together a number of times, worked with schizophrenics. And he talked about the fact that their schizophrenic episodes, where their experience of reality was often really challenged by what was going on inside their head, often went through these same stages. And what Groff was trying to do was help them, in the same way that, a Tibetan Buddhist monk will lead you through the experience of dying, letting you know what's happening. That's, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's letting you know, okay, and now this is going to happen, now this is going to happen, now let go. Stan Groff's idea was that you're going to go through these feelings, you're going to go through these experiences. And, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't tell you how true that was, but, Campbell and he discussed the fact that the imagery of their psychotic breaks almost always followed the same structure. As random and as irrational as they seemed from the outside, from the inside, it was this same process. And Groff's idea and Campbell's idea was that if you could help them become the hero of their own journey instead of being...
Right.
There's a lot of stories that you get where the hero doesn't succeed. The hero is crushed by the story. These are tragedies, right? Mm-hmm. And, so the idea is to try to lead people through to the other side. Mm-hmm. Anyway, yeah.
And so the last question here is, since you're an author and you're also working at this great foundation with these amazing revelations sort of bubbling up through Joseph Campbell's work, how did you use this when you wrote Risuko?
What a great question. The funny thing is, I was starting to write Risuko, and I got about 200 pages in and was absolutely blocked. I had, been working at the Campbell Foundation about 5 years at that point, and I just got stuck. And I had an outline, and I was what I thought was about a quarter of the way in. I look at it and I'm like, 200 pages, Jesus Christ, that's a lot. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I know where I want to end, and I know where I am, and I have no idea how to get from here to there, and so I put it away. In the meantime, that was 2004, so I put it away for more than 4 years. From 2006 to 2008, I worked full-time on bringing out the first new edition of The Hero with a Thousand Faces in 40 years. And it was published by New World Library up in Novato. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book. They did a great job with it. And so I was totally immersed in the hero's journey for 2 years and not thinking about my book. And what happened was, after the book was published, some friends of my wife's had read my early drafts of the first half, and they came back to me and said, "What? So how does it end?" And I said, "Well, I can tell you. I don't know. I can't finish it." He said, "No, we want you to write it. We want you to write it." And I was like, "Okay, fine, I'll write it." And I looked at it again for the first time in about 5-6 years, and because of all of this time thinking about plot and thinking about storytelling structure, I looked and I realized, first of all, that what I had wasn't the outline for a single book. It was the outline for a 3 or possibly 4-part series. And the reason that I had gotten 200 pages in and was only what I thought of as a quarter way in was because, guess what? I had a whole other book that I had to write. And I had to look at it and think, okay, here's the story for this book. And in fact, I then did my best as I re-outlined just this volume and then the other volumes. I did my best to toss Joseph Campbell out the window, okay? Because I didn't want, when I went to see The Matrix, I enjoyed it. It's a great, fun movie, interesting, mind-bending movie, but I can hear the pages and the heroes, Hero with a Thousand Faces turning.
Echoing loudly.
Oh my gosh. Every step in that journey is literally straight out of the book.
Yeah.
And, the original Star Wars trilogy, a little bit the same way. I mean, George Lucas famously wrote what is now called A New Hope, it was then Star Wars, with a copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces open next to the typewriter.
Yeah. Oh.
So he was very conscious of it. I tried not to, because I thought, I know this stuff, I don't need to work on it. But in fact, as I had finished the draft and started editing it, I realized that I start up a tree, I end up a tree. Mm-hmm. She, goes through a whole hero's journey in this book, and it's a 13-year-old girl. So, hero is a generic term. Campbell was an early 20th century guy, so for him, hero and he were generic. He meant women and men. So, my heroine went through a hero's journey, and I had managed to do that without overthinking it too much. Where it was helpful, especially as I rewrote, because I rewrote and rewrote and rewrote, was in looking at, okay, what is essential here? And thinking about the setting and thinking about, the character and who she was and how she was changed by the experience. So I would say there were 2 parts to the answer to the question. One was that I didn't think about it. But of course, as we said, it's in us. It's there, whether we are conscious of it or not. But second of all, as I was really looking at the novel from a craft point of view, it was something that I was able to use to help me focus my editorial eye and get rid of what wasn't necessary and focus on what was.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then you've got the circle on the cover.
That wasn't even me.
That's kind of cool.
It is a circle, and there's a bunch of stuff. If you read The Hero with a Thousand Faces and look at the book, there's a bunch of things that like chapter titles. I won't say more than that, but I at the time I was amused by them, because they were like, well, I know it, because originally it was chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, right. And I'm naming the chapters, and I'm like, and here we are. It's the beginning to head off towards the threshold, and now we're headed anyway. So, but this is a wonderful design, and I design a lot of the covers for my publishing company. But this one, I was too close to the book, and so I knew I needed somebody, and he found that circle.
Wow. So I think it looks great.
It is a great cover.
The sword you can see the sword moving around with it almost.
Yes, it's a brilliant, the whole thing is, I love that cover.
All right, well, our guest again today has been David Kudler, author of Risuko, publisher at Still Point Digital Press, and managing editor of the Joseph Campbell Foundation. And thank you so much for helping us understand how the hero's journey is there, whether we embrace it or reject it. It's how we enjoy stories.
Sure.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for having me,
Yeah.
Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And as always, remember to follow, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.